Thank you all for staying with us throughout the day. My name is Scott Lesensky. I work at the Institute of Peace. I'm sitting next to two gentlemen who need no introduction. I know that sounds like an overused expression, but in this case it's very true. I will say that when I first met Steve Hadley, when he joined the Institute of Peace a couple of years ago, he sat down with the staff. He was very generous to tell us what life is like as a national security advisor. And once he described it, after some of the staff were stunned, a few passed out, and others were just bewildered and amazed that particularly when he went through the daily routine, the 4 and 5 a.m. Showing up at work, the 7 days a week, year in, year out, you kind of wonder why anyone would want to do anything other than retire to Florida or a golf course after a stint as national security advisor. And that certainly goes for Dr. Brzezinski as well. And yet, they defy us as hard as that job can be, and it's most likely, I think we'd agree, probably the single most grueling job in Washington. These two individuals have remained so engaged, not just on foreign policy and national security issues more broadly, but particularly on questions of Middle East peace. And I think our debate in the United States and around the world is much better because of it. So we're very grateful to have them here today. I'm going to ask them a few questions. We'll have a conversation as we've done throughout the day, and then we'll have a few minutes for questions from you. First, let me ask Steve. The tenor of our conversation here from the morning, one theme has been a certain gloominess. There's been a theme of failure, some have argued, in terms of diplomatic efforts, a gloominess about the prospects for progress. There's been a lot of pessimism, I would say, throughout the day. Does it look as bad as it's been described throughout the day? Do you see any silver linings? Are you as, I hate to say it, as down as some of our presenters and some of the tenor of our debate today?
So the question is, does it look as bad as it looks? I think part of that is you had a lot of people over the course of the day who spent a lot of time trying to solve the Middle East. And as we know, the Middle East has not yet been solved. And I think there's a lot of frustration about that. I think, though, you could pull from the comments today that progress has been made conceptually. There is still a consensus, despite the difficulties, that a two-state solution is the outcome and is the path to peace. There is a belief that over time, through the work that was done now under 4 or 5 administrations, that the contours of a settlement on issues like territory and security and right of return and Jerusalem is beginning to emerge. Interestingly, as someone pointed out, there is public support for peace and for a two-state solution, 60 to 70%. Shibli Talhami has done some of the polling there in both the Palestinian and Israeli communities. That's the good news. The bad news, think in about the same proportion, 70%, that they won't see a peace in their lifetime. But support for the notion of peace and the two-state solution is strong. But I think the best news over the last 5 years is what has happened on the West Bank in the program of what we started to call institution building and rightly now start calling state building. Remember Salam Fayyad and President Abbas. Salam Fayyad 2 years ago said, we are going to get the West Bank and the Palestinian Authority to the point where the only thing wrong with the West Bank is the continued occupation. And they've done pretty well, and they've done pretty well in part with a lot of cooperation from the Israelis and particularly the IDF. And the result of it is you can see, and Palestinians can see, the emergence of a state on the West Bank. And the result is there has been security cooperation of really unprecedented terms, and the result has been quiet for Palestinians and Israelis, and an increasing standard of living a better life on the West Bank. And one of the dilemmas for the day has been, how do you preserve that progress at a time when there seems to be so little progress in the formal negotiating track? And we can talk a little bit about that. So I think there has been progress. There's a lot to build on, but clearly we're at a very difficult point.
If we can keep the same thread, Dr. Brzezinski, can this progress towards state building or institution building. Can progress on the ground be preserved and deepened absent a political process? The political process is as stuck now, it seems, as it's ever been.
Well, first of all, I think we have to be clear about the nature of the progress and about its scope. What I would say in responding to your first question, which then leads to the second one you just made, is that something has changed for the better over the course of the last 40 years. Namely, that there is a kind of an unstated predisposition to envisage peace in somewhat overlapping terminology in terms of definition of the key issues, borders, somehow related to 67. Some would say closely, with absolutely equal swaps and with few changes. Others would say with more changes and perhaps not entirely identical swaps and so forth. But nonetheless, it's no longer Eretz Israel, including Samaria and Judea. So that's progress. There are some hints of understanding that the Palestinian state has to be demilitarized. But here already there are quite a few disagreements. Demilitarized with Israeli forces along the west, on the West Bank, along the Jordan River, or really demilitarized and maybe with some international presence. That's less clear. Right of return, I think probably an underlying understanding that at best is going to be symbolic. So that's progress. In Jerusalem, well, there seems to be some variety of opinions among the Israeli leaders, but certainly far from a consensus and a great deal of opposition, rallying around the slogan that Jerusalem is not a settlement and has to be treated as something that's intrinsically part of Israel. So progress there is very mixed. But some progress nonetheless. But there has been not a progress, but I think a recession in another very important aspect of the peace process. Namely, over the last 40 years or so, the United States has been the principal peace promoter. I deliberately do not say peacemaker, because we haven't made peace. But we promoted peace. We promoted peace, at times with genuine commitment and sincerity, and some specific progress. Camp David won. More often than not, we pretended to be promoting peace, but still we were central in so doing. I think what has changed for the worse is the increasing identification of the United States with one of the two parties to the conflict. And I think that has happened very recently, very explicitly, and in some respects, maybe even in an embarrassing fashion insofar as the United States is concerned. I think the speech by the President to the United Nations was essentially a one-sided statement, very much a one-sided statement, even on the level of human sensitivity. Mm-hmm. It spoke about the suffering of the Israelis and their predecessors. There wasn't any commensurate reference to Palestinian suffering, which should not be ignored because it's part of the history, it's part of the problem. But more important than that, I don't think the United States is seriously now a peacemaker or even a peace promoter when it threatens sanctions if the Palestinian state gets some form of essentially symbolic recognition in the UN at the Vatican, if the United States as a country automatically moves to sanctions because Palestine gets accepted into UNESCO, the United States engages in very explicit criticisms of these tendencies. And when the Israelis retaliate, as they did just today or yesterday, with accelerating the process of constructing settlements, I didn't hear much of a reaction from the United States on that subject. So I think we're now in a situation in which the peace process is in a kind of state of suspension and with a great deal of uncertainties as to what might happen because of the volatile situation in the Middle East and last but not least, by some disturbing signals that at least some top leaders in Israel may be thinking that 2012 and the presidential elections might be a good time for addressing by force the issue of Iran, with all sorts of potential and predictable consequences for that, none of which would contribute to greater peace, but which might, in fact, enlarge the scope of uncertainty and risk in the region. So my view of it is a little more skeptical, a little more critical, a little more concerned.
Politics here, our elections, the internal American issues did come up a lot during the day, and I think we'll get back to that in just a minute. But you mentioned also this notion of uncertainty, and uncertainty is a theme that drew through many of the discussions. Maybe I can ask the question to both of you, starting with Steve Hadley. How, at a time, even if you see the larger political process is largely stuck, the United States has a tremendous investment. We have a tremendous investment in Israeli-Egyptian peace, Israeli-Jordanian peace, this progress on the ground that Steve talked about, largely funded and steered by the United States. We have our goal, the consensus you talked about, Dr. Brzezinski, on the contours of a settlement, a two-state solution. How do you keep as much international consensus and focus and investment toward that goal of a two-state solution, in addition to our investment, our past investment? How do you manage such a portfolio in an era of such great uncertainty? Who are the actors on the Arab side? If we want to talk about the Arab Peace Initiative, who do we talk to? How do you manage our investment portfolio, if I can borrow a financial metaphor, with such uncertainty all around us?
Well, it's difficult, and one of the questions is, who do you talk to in the Arab world when a number of the states that are going to be critical of this process are in such political transition? And it is a dilemma. It's probably one of the things that led a number of people today to say that, though it was not stated explicitly, but a number of people said the politics in Israel, in the Palestinian community in the United States are not geared to making this a propitious time for a peace initiative. People will gain more politically by saying no than saying yes. I think another consideration is given the transitions that are underway in the Arab world, it's probably not a propitious time to do it, recognizing that an Israeli-Palestinian peace needs to be part of an Israeli-Arab peace, and the Arabs may not be in a position really to come and play. So there are a lot of reasons that why I think speakers said initiative is going to have to wait till 2013. In the interim, though, how do you keep the consensus alive? I think a number of speakers said the way you do that is to try to have a state-building process on the West Bank to reward the progress that the Palestinian Authority has made by giving them more security responsibility as they show themselves and as the IDF makes clear that they are able to do it. And in areas where they have increasing security responsibility, giving them more administrative control, so that the Palestinians can see that gradually a state is emerging, giving them the authority to do some development assistance and the like. And I think that is a right approach, and I think it can keep the principles of progress alive. But one of the things that I learned in this conference, which I hadn't focused on, is there's a dilemma here. To do that, you have to somehow keep the progress of state building on the West Bank separate from the ups and downs of the political process. And that means not only in terms of negotiations, but it also means what's happening up in New York. And the problem is, and I understand why the Palestinians are pushing forward in New York, but the price they will pay is, as they move forward in New York, there will be a response. We see it in the U.S. Congress, a desire to cut off funds. Prime Minister Netanyahu announced that the Israelis were going to suspend the transfer of funds. The taxes they collect for the Palestinian Authority, they're going to not, at least for an interim period of time, not pass them. those kinds of measures are going to begin to erode the progress on the West Bank. So one of the real tricks in this is how do you manage a very difficult political process? No active negotiations, no prospect for active negotiations, the Palestinian movements in New York. How do you try to insulate that from the good thing that is happening and that we want to encourage the state building and institution building in the West Bank? Very hard problem.
Dr. Brzezinski?
Well, it's very nice to say that maybe there'll be progress in 2013. I certainly hope so. I wish it was sooner. But to me, the question is, if there may be progress in 2013, what might happen in the meantime in 2012? That might be more important. And that may, in fact, determine what then 2013 looks like. I think the problem is that the situation as it is now, which is kind of stuck with the peace promoter having changed sides, in effect, the situation could deteriorate. There could be continued spreading of the settlements. There could be some resumption of violence by the Palestinians. Both the Palestinians and the Israelis are divided. That may further contribute to complexity. The fact that the Palestinians are divided is visible because some of them are in the West Bank, some are in Gaza. But the Israelis are also divided. Very major divisions within Israel. And if there is some breakdown, these differences could become accentuated. And that, of course, is pertinent to the key proposition, which I think after 40 years we should face and not ignore. Namely, the parties to the conflict will never resolve it on their own. Not only are they divided, but one party is much stronger than the other. So the stronger party has no particular incentive to make concessions in advance. And the weaker party is too weak to make concessions in advance because it fears that the other side will pocket them and not reciprocate. So without someone on the outside, and there's only one party on the outside, and that's the United States, there is not going to be progress towards peace. In the meantime, the American position, not only having shifted, has also become more isolated. Take a look at that vote on UNESCO. How did America's principal allies vote? Yes, a couple of them, I think 3 in fact, voted with us. All the others abstained or voted against us. That is a kind of global testimonial regarding American leadership, and it's not a particularly positive one. So I think the situation is, in fact, deteriorating. And I will again reiterate what I said a minute ago. It could get much worse if there was some explosion. I read Israeli press regularly, and it provides a lot of little insights regarding changes in the leadership of the Mossad, IDF, the nature of the changes, strategic predispositions of the new team. And there's also very explicit statements to the effect that not only the prime minister, but the defense minister, the vice premier, Barak, are both now inclining to advocate some sort of action against Iran. Now, what would be the most opportune moment for doing that? When the United States is in the midst of elections and the incumbent president is very worried that he will lose and therefore will be under even greater pressure than this year to make compromises that go contrary to his own fundamental beliefs. So I think the situation is somewhat justifiably justifying some degree of concern.
Your question, if I can just draw the two of you out, your question highlights, Steve mentioned one delicacy, which is how to keep the progress on the ground in the Palestinian territories and how to insulate it and how to deepen it and keep it separate from the political process, which is moving. But, your comments, Dr. Brzezinski, I think, draw on another delicacy, which is a theme throughout these 30 or 35 years we've been so intensively involved in. It's how do you reassure Israel, a country, although strong, a country with deep anxieties? You've dealt with those anxieties for a long time. I think every American a diplomat has dealt with them. How do you reassure Israelis? How do you maintain their confidence and yet still keep them kind of on the track toward peace? Or on the issue of Iran, which you brought up, within the international consensus or the U.S. strategy on how to address. I mean, that's a very delicate balancing act.
Well, we can
ask each of you.
We can discuss in detail how to deal with Iran, which is an additional problem. But on this question of reassurance, there has to be some sort of rational sense of balance in responding to that. You don't reassure someone by simply doing anything they want and trying even harder and being told to try harder in reassuring them. You reassure them by treating them seriously, but also by indicating that in our relationship with them, which involves, in my judgment, a basic moral commitment to the security of Israel, there can be differences. These differences can involve different assessments of what is not only in their interest, but what is in our interest. And our interest is important here, because if in the long run, the end result of this growing turmoil and frustration and fragmentation, the United States gets pushed out of the region, how much money would one invest in the future of Israel? You know, when I first went into the White House, we had good relations with the four most important countries in the region: Iran, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Turkey. And just consider the state of these relations today. It's not a reflection of American success in the region. I think, from a historical perspective, it's an indication that the trend line is now increasingly pointing in the direction of the diminution and then eventually termination of significant American influence in the region. And what does that mean for Israel in the long run?
We could have a long discussion about, the way I would say it is not how you reassure Israel, but how do you be an honest broker?
Yeah, I agree with that.
And I think if you're trying to get countries and leaders to do hard things, pressuring them particularly publicly and making them uncertain of your support is not the way to do that. I think if you want to make countries and leaders do hard things, you've got to put your arm around them. You've got to reassure them. You've got to make it clear that you understand their interests and are prepared to protect those interests. In terms of Israel, that, of course, starts with security and making very clear that the United States is committed to Israeli security and Israel's right to defend it against terrorism. And I think I saw President Bush deal with Prime Minister Sharon and bring him to the point where I believe if he had not had a stroke, we would have a comprehensive peace today. I think we have to do the same thing with the Palestinians. And I think personally, and I'll get a lot of criticism for this, the United States and Israel missed a bet when the Palestinians decided they would go to New York. I think our response should have been, great. We recognize a Palestinian state. We've been calling for it for over a decade. Fine, we welcome a Palestinian state. Now let's sit down and start negotiating the contours of that state. And we would not be in the kind of lose-lose situation we're in now, because I do worry about the progress in the West Bank. And the only way I can see it is for us to do four things. One, we've got to try to work with Israelis and Palestinians so we don't get in an action-reaction cycle that leads to an Israeli-Palestinian confrontation, and we could go there very quickly. Second, we have got to try to make the state building in the West Bank an example of political progress to keep hope alive among the Palestinian community and to reduce the risk of violence so people don't have to demonstrate because they see things are actually getting better. Three, I think we've got to consider whether there are some low-level dialogues, private hopefully, not public, between Israelis and Palestinians that can get them talking about something, about what are the best modalities for proceeding when the time comes to talk? What are the kinds of security protections that are needed? And Israelis and Palestinians have to be committed, if we're going to do that while those talks may not succeed and may not go anywhere, they must not be allowed to fail. Better you just keep talking. And finally, I think we need to be active in helping the transitions in the Middle East so that the people of the Middle East are able to and are are able to establish a democratic future for themselves. We know what failed transitions look like. Iran is the example of '79, a revolution also in the name of freedom and democracy that was hijacked by the mullahs, and we've had a problem ever since. And I think if we can help make some of those transitions to democratic governments, it improves the context for Israeli and Palestinians coming for Middle East peace. It's not grand, but I think that's really where our policy needs to be.
Let me add to that.
Sure.
Let me just add to that. Let's take a very specific case, the UN issue, the Palestinian statehood, UNESCO. I would personally, for example, I would have gone to the Israelis and said, yes, there are problems with the Palestinians getting recognition as a state in the UN, and we understand your concerns. It might not be quite as bad as you think, because essentially kind of the equivalent of Vatican wouldn't be that dangerous, but I can see the point of your concerns. Okay, we'll support you on that. But when it comes to UNESCO, why don't you surprise everybody and vote for it? Support the Palestinian claim to UNESCO status. Why? What difference does it make, really, fundamentally? In other words, you don't support someone in a two-party conflict by reassuring them to the point that you're essentially following their maximum line. You try to establish some flexibility so that there's progress. It's also an opportunity for Israel. When Netanyahu says, I'm for peace, he then can demonstrate that on some issues he's prepared to make essentially symbolic concessions. It would be a symbolic vote, and yet it would surprise global public opinion. And creating a different psychology of the conflict is essential. And I think we have abandoned too much, in all bluntness, for domestic political reasons, in the posture of what a real promoter of peace ought to be acting like.
In the parlance of Washington, you've each given a pretty long list of action items for the United States, some similar, but also some quite different. It's a pretty long list. We have a few minutes left. I want to draw in, it's a rather extraordinary group that we've had gathered today. There's microphones. Some of you just have loud voices, so I know you can speak without. Let's take a few questions. And I want to gather two or three because our time is so limited here. So, and if I don't know you, introduce yourself. Said Erekat.
Thank you, Scott. My question to both Dr. Brzezinski and Mr. Hadley. Do you believe there's too much a blurring of interest, perceived interest, Israeli interest, and American interest on Capitol Hill that may be actually undermining U.S. influence and prestige worldwide? Thank you.
Next question. No, just kidding. But we're going to gather a couple. Think about that for a minute because our time is so short. Here, Oda Aberdeen, please.
Dr. Brzezinski, what lessons have we learned from...
So what?
What lessons have we learned from Camp David I, achieved peace between the Egyptians and the Israelis, because that peace has stabilized the region. Now it's been over 25 years. What do you recommend to President Obama to do?
Congress and domestic politics, lessons from Camp David here, and I think it's Craig Charney on the...
Both of you suggested that the line of opposition to any Palestinian representation in UN organizations was a mistake. In that case, two questions. A, what do we do now in order to try to avoid the train wreck that seems to be approaching? And B, the Israelis seem to be particularly concerned about Palestinian access to the International Court of Justice or the International Criminal Court. How could we finesse that one?
Three very easy questions. We could do a lightning round. If we do, we can have one final round of questions. Camp David was certainly for Dr. Brzezinski. Steve, if you want to do the first or the third question, either.
President's got to lead with Congress. President's got to lead with Congress. The president has a lot of capacity to do that. You know, I go back to the very unpopular surge in Iraq in 2007, 2008, which the Congress clearly wanted to defeat, and Congress was unable to do so, even though a lot of the country was with them. So the president's got to lead on that one. In terms of the UN, what's next? I'm going to take a little page out of what Dr. Brzezinski said. I think the United States Israel and the Palestinians need to find a way to have a conversation about where this goes in New York. And maybe you can get a list of institutions the Palestinians can join, which the Israelis won't give the Israelis heartburn, and some that really will. And maybe you can agree on something like that. Secondly, I think then the Palestinians need to avoid the temptation to start using the UN platforms to try and move against Israel in terms of sanctions, in terms of, International Criminal Court, those kinds of things. And third, they need to avoid the temptation of using those international institutions as venues to batter Israel publicly. So I think there needs to be a way of trying to work out an acceptable understanding as to where this can go. And finally, I think both Israelis and Palestinians need to avoid overreaction once they've worked out this roadmap. They're going to have to manage their own politics.
I'll just respond to two. Too much influence in Congress? Absolutely. The one area in which the president really has leadership, room for maneuver, is in foreign policy, provided he asserts it. If he doesn't, of course, nature abhors the vacuum, Congress fills it, and if there are pressure groups and lobbies that sponsor it, that will be done even more quickly. I was once sent by President Carter to talk to the leaders of the Senate, Senator Byrd and Senator Baker, and I had to ask each of them the same question separately. If the president goes into a confrontation with Israel, Prime Minister Begin, will you support him? And each of them gave me the same answer separately. If he takes the lead, we will. If he doesn't, why should we? It's as simple as that. And to this day, a lot of the congressmen or senators who sign these letters, these petitions, 300 to 1, then phone up the White House and say, we just want the president to know that if he takes a stand, we're not bound. We'll follow him. And the country too. If the president doesn't lead, he doesn't have leadership. It's as simple as that. And I think that's been the problem lately. Lessons from Camp David? Well, again, a very simple one. The mediator made it very clear to the parties to the conflict that whichever party prevents a settlement will be a party that the United States will be more adverse towards. Not abandon, not break, but more critical. And we had a situation in which Saddam was going to leave, abort, and Carter went to him in the middle of the night and said to him, if you leave, it's finished. Between you and me, and between you and Egypt and America. And we made it very clear, not so much to Begin, because he was always very tough, but to Weizmann and to Dayan. Don't push the envelope, because if you push it too much, you will pay. And that was credible. Now, is that an abandonment of Israel? Is it throwing Israel under the bus, according to a would-be presidential candidate? No, I think it's a service. If we're really seriously committed to peace in the Middle East, we have to be engaged. We have to stay. And if the ground shifts under our feet, 50 years from now. I remember when I went to the Middle East to sell the Camp David agreement, what struck me very much was that one of the royalties involved, I won't say which one, who hesitated to endorse Camp David, said to me, just think of one thing. The Crusaders were in Jerusalem for 90 years. That's all. I mean, that is in the background of a great many people's minds. And the United States is pushed out. What does it mean? So we have to be worried about our position. We have to think about the possibility of conflict with Iran and its consequences. And we have to be steadfast, and not one-sided in our commitment to peace.
Both your comments on leadership provide an interesting bookend, in fact, to the morning. And Secretary Baker, even in his comments about the issue of funding, came up in the Congress, and he complimented the administration, praised them for taking a strong position on maintaining the funding for the Palestinian Authority, in addition to some criticisms he had. But these are two interesting bookends to the day's conversation. Let's just we have a few minutes, two more questions. One here on the side. Stephanie, thanks.
Thank you.
If you could just introduce yourself, please.
Okay. My name is Alma Abdelhadi. I'm from George Mason University School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution. I teach there. What advice do you both have for the diaspora community in regard with moving the official process forward?
And right here in the middle, I'm going to give special treatment to our generous speaker, Howard Sumka, who devoted some time to us today. Thank you.
We've heard a lot of We've heard a lot of people talk about continuing the state building while we wait for 2013 for something serious to happen. The Palestinian Authority has been building a state for 2 years or maybe 4 years, depending on when you count from, and they've gotten precious little political reward from Israel in the way of easing elements of the occupation. I don't know why we would expect things to be different over the next 2 years, and I worry that there could, in fact, be a serious move by the PA to just simply dissolve itself and turn the keys over, as I've said, back to Israel. Why would you be optimistic that we could keep doing this for 2 more years?
He's optimistic because he works at the Institute of Peace. That's why, right? I think Steve maybe could take the latter question. Dr. Brzezinski, could you take the first one? And maybe we'll keep it economical that way.
Or you can.
Well, first of all, on the latter question, I'm not optimistic, so I don't have to answer it.
Yes.
Well,
And secondly, on the diaspora, well, I think the diaspora, depending whose it is, ought to be in general for the peace process. And to the extent the diaspora is located in America and is composed of Americans or would-be Americans, it has a right to say, we want the United States to be engaged as a serious peacemaker and not as a party to the conflict. I think it's as fundamental as that. And to the extent that the diasporas can talk to each other, particularly, let's say, the Arab diaspora and the Jewish or Israeli diaspora, that would be even best. The more direct contact between the two groups, the better.
I really respectfully reject the premise of the question. You say we've been doing state building and we keep up until something serious happens. State building is very serious business. The whole question that Israelis have had about a two-state solution is the neighbor next door to us going to be a democratic, strong state that will be an ally in the war on terror, or is it going to be a safe haven for terrorists? And state building answers that question in a way that is reassuring to Palestinians and reassuring to Israelis. I think it is extremely important and that it be allowed to continue. I've suggested some other things I think that we could do to prepare the ground when things are a little bit more propitious in 2013. Secondly, that state building has succeeded in part because of substantial Israeli cooperation. Now, they don't move as fast. They don't move as far. You know, I could go on at length of conversations I've had with Israelis about that state building business, but they have cooperated, and the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, has cooperated, and they are the biggest proponent of what's happened because it has brought calm to Israelis and calm to Palestinians. And my own view would be for the PA now to turn the keys back to Israel. I mean, I can't imagine why anyone would think that was in their interests, to basically quit. I mean, how can you do that to your people?
We don't have time for more questions now, but one thing I can promise you and guarantee you, this is not the last word from either gentleman on this subject. Maybe their next words will be here at the Institute or somewhere else, but I want to thank both of them. And before we adjourn for the evening, Richard Solomon, I invite back up to the podium, President of the Institute of Peace, just for a couple of minutes of closing words, please.
Well, you've all been a terrific audience to stay with us through a long but a very rich day. And I just want to say on behalf of the Baker Institute, Secretary of State Baker, I know he had to leave a little early, but he, as well as we, were very pleased to host this conference. Congress has given us, as part of our charter, a convening power, that is to bring together on a bipartisan basis, on the basis of all the sides of a given conflict, the opportunity to share views, and I think today's event really shows the value of it. This facility gives us the opportunity to do some convening of this sort in a very attractive environment. And so we're grateful to Congress and all those private donors who made this institution possible. Hearing Steve Hadley describe yet another instance where fate intervened and yet another missed opportunity to come to closure, it just hits you in the gut that there have been so many of these. Is there a star-crossed situation here? But I would just pick up Zbig's point, which we heard throughout the day, about how important American leadership is in trying to get a hold of this situation and hopefully move it in a positive direction. You'll be hearing more about today. We will provide in various forms a summary of all the good presentations that were made, and undoubtedly there will be some follow-up because the challenge remains. So again, thank you all for coming, and more to follow. Thank you.